emails and chatting on Instant Messenger. Vicky, who worked for ODSS, would look at their resume, listen to how they spoke English to decide where they might get hired. Then one by one, the candidates would meet with a human resource representative who worked for the BPO and was the one which was hiring on that particular day. This man was named Sandeep, which is not his real name. I'm using a pseudonym. Sandeep spoke to each candidate, giving them words to pronounce to determine if they were worth considering to work in an international call center. Say pleasure, measure, explosion, sunshine, shoe section, social security. One by one, he would have the candidates repeat the words after him, listening for what the industry calls mother tongue influence, or MTI. Sometimes he would call me into his office after speaking with a candidate and ask me to sit with them to fix their speech. Other times he would simply reject or pass them on to the next round. In the case of the former, Sandeep would say, fix the sha sa or the ja ja, or simply fix his speech, his pronunciation or grammar. And I would sit and practice with the candidate before sending them on to a phone interview with a professional accent assessment. From this interview, each candidate would receive a score. Those who scored above a 3 would move on to the next round. Those who scored below would either be sent home or have to go for another round after another ODSS trainer tried to fix their pronunciation or grammar. Asking Sandeep for feedback after one of my candidates failed, he would report to me things like he has too much mother tongue influence, MTI, or she has harsh vowels or hard consonants. He needs to sound more neutral, more polished. From this and all my glorious inexperience, I was meant to create exercises that would get the candidate to speak in a way that would earn a higher score. In those first months of working with ODSS, I picked up on a few tricks here and there, but often felt at a loss, which would only improve after months of experience and training that I would eventually get years later. At the time, however, I would do my best to teach sounds and choose practice words, though there were mixed results, all the while observing the other 6 rounds of interview that job candidates went through. Every day, we would repeat this process up to 30 times because we would have somewhere usually between 10 and 30 candidates come in for a job interview. All of which was meant so that the people who ended up working in call centers who went through training would have what the BPO industry calls a neutral accent or a global accent. However, later on this one particular day, after working for a given 8 hours, we took a quick smoke break on the balcony. On this break, Sandeep looked out and then asked me, tell me, you're a language expert, what exactly is a neutral accent? The moment where he asked this question was monumental. When starting my research, I did not expect to have someone who is meant to be an expert interlocutor in my field turn around to ask me my very own research question, and in a moment, I was stumped into silence. My own growing frustration with not being able to hear the apparent mistakes that these job candidates were making, and my own theoretical skepticism that any accent could ever be neutral, made me want to explain that it's a farce. And yet, we had just spent 8 hours trying to hear and make neutral accents, and it seemed rude and bad business, if not altogether untrue, to tell him that his job was a fraud. In the moment, I gave him the best answer I could. I told him it's basically convent English, like the way convent wale bache speak. He nodded, accepting my answer. So this interaction poses a few potential problems that we could think about, sort of theoretically. So one question is, why did Sanjay feel like he needed to ask me what a neutral accent was when he uses the term in his daily interactions all the time? And much of his work is geared towards creating a neutral accent. So more generally, why do people who use language, as a way to make important social and cultural distinctions, why are they not fully aware of those distinctions? And then another question is, how do we go about understanding what a new accent is if people who use the term themselves don't fully know? We can't just ask them. So how do we study the social dimensions of language, sort of an interaction methodologically, when a simple interview doesn't necessarily suffice? So this is a good time for questions. I know it's early on. If there are any, I can take them. Otherwise, I'll move on to discuss sort of linguistic anthropology, what it is, what the method is, and what its history is.
Yeah, no one's raised their hands or has any questions.
Okay, perfect. So in order to sort of answer some of these questions or get into them, it's useful to think about what is linguistic anthropology as a method, but also as a discipline, and in what ways might it depart from or have different goals than the linguistics that we learn as generative linguists or general linguists. So in order to understand what linguistic anthropology is, we have to kind of go back to the founding of the American approach to anthropology, because linguistic anthropology is considered one of the subfields of anthropology. And the founder of this approach is Franz Boas, who came to the United States from Germany. And his research, he was in Europe, was on the color of seawater and why it looks different depending on where you stand or which ocean you're looking at. And then he moved on to have an interest in humanity that was kind of almost based upon this idea that the same can look different depending on who you are or where you stand. So the anthropology is the study of humans, right? Anthropos is humans. And in American anthropology, the field that Franz Boas proposed in the 1800s, it has 4 fields, so it's a holistic approach. So within an anthropology department, you'll find people who study biological anthropology. So if anyone watches the series Bones, she's a forensic anthropologist, which is a type of biological anthropology. They study human biology, human disease, those kinds of things, human evolution, bones, those kinds of, like the sort of biological aspect of being human. Then there's archaeology, which is the study of the material record to look into the past. So, they do excavations, they try to understand the past, not just from a historical record, but from looking at the things past civilizations have left behind. There's cultural anthropology, where people study different types of social practices and cultural difference. And then there's linguistic anthropology, which is what I study. So the idea isn't that these are separate parts, but rather in order to understand a human phenomenon, we have to understand it from a biological perspective, a social perspective, an archaeological perspective, and even a linguistic perspective. And that any approach to a question needs to be taken sort of from a holistic perspective, which differs from other fields of anthropology. With this, the idea of history is central because Franz Boas and the American approach takes a stance of historical relativism. And what that means is that at the time, most anthropologists and most social theorists thought that some cultures were less developed than other cultures. So Lewis Henry Morgan is a good example, or even theories like from Marx and Engels, right? They posited that some cultures were more primitive and some cultures were more advanced, and that especially like hunter-gatherer cultures or cultures outside of Europe in particular were primitive ones, and we could understand our past by looking at them. And what Franz Boas said, that is not the case. Every culture needs to be understood within its own historical context, and all of humanity needs to be understood sort of through this historical lens, that cultural differences, linguistic differences, they're a product of history, basically, that over time people are socialized. They also practice what is called salvage anthropology. So what you see on the left, this is one of my favorite pictures of Boas. He is demonstrating a Kwakiutl dance. So the idea was that there are cultures in the United States, these people studied American Indian cultures, that are dying and languages that are dying, and we need to record them before they die. And that was one of the major projects that they had. He had students that are, in some senses, sometimes more famous than himself. There's Ruth Benedict, Margaret Mead, who are famous within gender studies roles, but also Edward Sapir, who is, so Boas himself was a linguist. He studied languages, specifically Eskimo and Kwakiutl were the ones that he was the most involved in studying. Kwakiutl is from the Pacific Northwest region, and Eskimo is from Alaska and northern Canada. And one of the main contributions he provided in terms of like linguistics is this work he did on alternating sounds. So at the time, as I said, people thought that some languages were more primitive, especially Native American languages, some tribal languages in the States. And one of the ways in which they perceived that is that they thought that some sounds themselves in those languages were more primitive in that they were less developed and therefore would switch or alternate. And one of the observations that Boas made was that there is actually no alternation of sounds in these languages, rather an alternation in perception. That the linguists were actually the ones who were perceiving a shift due to the fact that they were not socialized to hear the sounds that were being presented in these new languages. And therefore they heard different sounds and sometimes could not figure out quite which one sound it was. And that was where the phenomenon of alternating sounds came from, which was a thing at the time. But this kind of goes back to the idea that all languages are equally developed, but that they are a product of prior socialization, and that when you come from the outside to a language, your lack of socialization then impacts how you can approach it. His student, Edward Sapir, is probably the most famous of the linguistic anthropologists, and he's also widely considered sort of the founder of that particular subfield. So he also practiced linguistic historical relativism, which is what we were talking about before, right? But he also went on to write about this idea of the unconscious patterning of social behavior. So just as he noted in grammar, with language, there are patterns that the speaker themselves might not be aware of, even though they follow. He argued that in all forms of communication, in all forms of social behavior, there are such patterns that those who actually are following the patterns may not be aware of. So they may not know the fact that they're doing it, or if they know they're doing it, they might not know why. And for him, communication, and kind of one of the main gifts he gave linguistic anthropology, is this idea that communication is a part of all social behavior. So every cultural pattern and every single act of social behavior involves communication in either an explicit or an implicit sense. So this is kind of a key observation, that some types of communication are explicit, like language, right? So when I say close the door, I'm explicitly saying things, it's in the code, exactly what I mean. But then there's also implicit communication, which could be body language. But for him, it also could mean social regularity. So he would consider societies themselves communicating in the sense that his example is going to church every Sunday. So if everybody in your society goes to church every Sunday, there'll be all these little things that indicate that everyone is going. It'll be in the media, it'll be replicated, and you might not even know why you go to church on Sunday, except you just know that you should. And nobody told you to go to church on Sunday, but you know that you have to. So when he talks about explicit and implicit communication, he's actually defining communication at a level that's much more broad than just language itself. So the importance of the unformulated and unverbalized communication of society is so great that one who is not intuitively familiar with them is likely to be baffled by the significance of certain kinds of behavior, even if he is thoroughly aware of their external forms and verbal symbols that accompany them. So what he means by this is, for instance, in the United States, if we say something that we want to happen and we don't want to jinx it, we might say knock on wood and then knock on a surface. So somebody who's not familiar with this practice or has never, might understand when I say knock on wood, they know what those words mean, but they won't know why I'm doing it, right? Because I've been sort of socialized to do it, so if makes sense to me, but for an outsider, it won't. And that's the same idea of cultural relativism or linguistic relativism. Okay, so one of the main tools of anthropology is ethnography. And you'll notice a slightly weird picture that we have here. It's Malinowski, who's one of the early ethnographers who worked in the Trobriand. And this is sort of the image that we have of ethnography, of some European guy going to some other country, usually a colony, and with them for an extended period of time and then writing about their culture, which is no longer the practice today as much, but is where the sort of origin started. So ethnography is a method of research, right, which involves extended qualitative research with mixed methods. Usually you go somewhere, you spend every day as a part of that situation that you're studying. You use participant observation, which means that you don't just observe what people do, you also participate in it to get a fuller sense, to see where sometimes you gain a different idea of things from participating. And then it's also a method of writing, right? Because graphy means to write in Greek. So it's this idea of writing a culture. And even for linguistic anthropologists, as should be clear after we talked about Sapir, writing about a language goes hand in hand with writing about social behavior, because from a linguistic anthropology perspective, you're studying language as it is, or as it elucidates social behavior, right? So as it elucidates different cultural norms, or makes sense of. One of the ideas behind this is this idea that Clifford Geertz brought up, which is that you take something that is very familiar to you, so like from your own culture, and you understand why it's strange, why it's not the norm everywhere in the world, why some places don't do things the way you do it. And you also take practices from another situation and you try to understand sort of their internal logics and why they happen and make them familiar. And all of this is geared towards identifying patterns in cultural behavior. So because in linguistic anthropology, language is sort of a way to look into social interaction and how people interact with each other, how to look at cultural norms, language is actually used more like a tool to study things than of interest necessarily in and of itself. So that means that people do research now on all kinds of topics, from politics. There was a recent article about Donald Trump and his tiny hands in the media, but also the politics of migration and documentation in the United States and other places. So like legalities of migration, law, political protest, fashion and design. There's a really great paper on knockoff brands and Tamil markets by Kostas Nakasis. Media, one of my friends at Ashoka, she studies Bhojpuri cinema, for instance. But everything from business, work, education, music, etc. And language is the method by which we study these other things. And that's kind of like where we come to it. So like there are linguistic anthropologists such as myself who might study accent phenomenon or other things. We usually study these to study like social inequality or ways that discrimination, and like in my case, rather than just studying the accent to understand what accents are, if that makes sense. So this is another good time for questions, if there are any.
No questions yet.
Okay, was everything clear?
Oh, Anjali
like in
has
terms
a
of,
question.
okay, great.
Yeah, Anjali, go ahead, ask it.
Do I need to look at the chat? Yeah, I show that as a really good photo of Boas. Okay, great. So the question is about the difference between linguistic anthropology and anthropological linguistics. Is that correct? So linguistic anthropology is an American discipline, right? It's part of the four-field method, right? So everything I've discussed is linguistic anthropology. Anthropological linguistics is usually used to describe like people who use language sort of. I mean, often people. I think it's more used like sort of in the European tradition, where it's not necessarily as ingrained. Well, I wouldn't say it's not ingrained in anthropology, but it's often used more like in the sense of like documenting the language, but also documenting folklore. And I've noticed it happening a little bit more in like folklore studies. So I think there is sort of a difference. I don't personally come across anthropological linguistics as much in the United States. I've seen it used in India more. I get the sense that the people who use it tend to do work that's not as geared towards necessarily like social theory, but more like preserving the language and the culture of the people that they study. So they'll like be gathering folk tales, gathering ceremonies, and more sort of in the folkloric tradition. I don't know if that answers your question, but so there's kind of a distinction, not a super a huge. I mean, I think they're just different, used in different contexts. Cool. Any other questions? Everything makes sense with Boas and Sapir. I think it's also worth noting that there are sort of grandfathers of our field that we share with other branches of linguistics. Roman Jakobson would be the most notable. For those of you who are master's students and may have not read much about Roman Jakobson, he's one of the first people to talk about distinctive features from the Prague school. He also is used in linguistic anthropology. He actually was an acquaintance of Boas and other forthcoming linguistic anthropologists and anthropologists. Worked in New York for many years, and actually one of his later students, Michael Silverstein, is one of the major figures in the field today. So especially when it comes to like his work on poetics, that gets taken up in linguistic anthropology a lot, but also things like markedness are things that we work with. So there are some like shared genealogies. It's just that it's developed a little bit differently, and the kind of basic questions of linguistic anthropology are geared towards language as social behavior rather than language as cognitive facility, right? So they're different sets of questions to study sometimes similar data. Okay, so get rid of this little chat buddy. Okay. Okay. Okay, so let's revisit the problems that we had and see if we can answer them. So first of all, Sanjay, from my introduction, we should understand a little better now why he felt the need to ask me what a neutral accent was, right? And why people are unaware. Language, just like any social practice, as we know from both Boas and Sapir, involves different degrees of awareness and even the ability to notice speech patterns. So Sanjay may also find, or actually I know for a fact, sometimes we'd actually have these arguments where we wouldn't understand the feedback that the assessor gave. They would say hard vowels and we'd be like, I don't know what hard vowels means. And we kind of laughed about that. But also that a lot of communication might be covert and we might not know why we do it. So we may even use the term, but then not have a sense of what it means and use it as a tool, but not necessarily know the patterns behind the use of the word neutral. And then in terms of how do we understand what's neutral and how do we get at the social dimensions of language? Well, in linguistic anthropology, one method would be ethnography, right? So you try to observe those patterns, both overt and covert. You try to observe multiple players in whatever situation you're studying and try to find sort of the bigger picture and the structures that give rise to certain forms of communication. So my own research methods, I use participant observation, as you might have noticed. So for instance, I will participate in training in call centers, I'll observe it. I participate in the hiring process, I observe the hiring process. I record the results of interviews. So I'll take a voice sample of somebody at the beginning, and then I'll see how they do. I'll track sort of like what place they fail, what was the feedback given. I record trading interactions, so I'll go into a training session, I'll record it, and then also track people's career trajectories and their social backgrounds. So who exactly is getting hired, who is, ending up with a job, who's not ending up with a job, what kinds of jobs people end up with, how are these decisions being made, and how does that relate to their own socialization and who they are. I also do oral history in terms of like the history of the industry. So I talk to different people who have worked in the industry for a long time about the changes that they've seen and how this term neutral actually ended up coming about. And I can talk about that later. It's not a part of my presentation as such, but I'm happy to discuss it in questions, any of these things. I'm not going to be able to go into a lot of data, but if there's anything that people are interested in, I'm really happy to talk about it. Okay, so, but then we're still left with the question of like, what is neutral, right? It's not just a sound pattern, right? The same person, I noticed that often the same person that did not get hired on a Friday would get hired on a Saturday, even without any training, right? Like, it's also not just a social identity, right? There's discriminatory trends that I would notice, but like, even if people would say things like, oh, Biharis don't speak with a neutral accent, then there would be someone from Bihar who got hired, right? So it's not just the social identity of being Bihari, it's not just the sound pattern, there's something going on. It's also constantly changing over time, right? So day to day, the protocols or what how people are hiring might change. And also it varies between assessors or trainers. So some trainers might pick up on different features is another thing that I noticed. So this presents us with a new problem, right? The fact that languages or language varieties, they're not homogeneous. And I think that you guys have probably already learned this in your classes. And in generative linguistics, you tend to deal with this by focusing in on an individual's language, right? So you try to get to something that's at the individual, but that clearly doesn't work for linguistic anthropology. Because we're not studying the individual, right? We're studying society. Also an issue, social groups are hard to define. Things are constantly changing. Language as a construct is a hot mess, right? One way that people in social linguistics and linguistic anthropologies have decided to talk about this kind of variation, though, is in terms of registered dialect and sociolect. So a sociolect is a manner of speech as defined by like social status. So like class, gender, caste, race. So an example would be like a Cockney versus a received pronunciation will tell you something maybe about people's social standing, right? Dialect has to do with geographic region. So for instance, I have a Wisconsin accent. So people can, I'm from Wisconsin, we speak in a specific way there. And then register is a manner of speech which is associated with a place or a social role. And there's some overlap here. Dialect and Sociolect are kind of in one camp, and then Register kind of, you might notice, incorporates both the idea of place, but also social status or social personhood. So an example of this would be like a legal register. So lawyers have a certain set of words that they use. They're associated with the courtroom and with people who practice law, right? So that would be considered a register. The paper that I circulated that people may or may not have read, it's fine if you didn't, deals with register. So the way it defines it is manners of speech emblematic of personhood, right? So different forms of speech could be lexical, prosodic, phonetic, whatever, that are socially viewed as standing for a type of person. And that type of person could be place, it could be job role, it could be just like perceived intellect, right? Or class. Like there could be so many different things that personhood means, but it's just that there's an association between the speech and the type, social type that we're getting at. So some terms that might be useful in understanding register is there's a register range, right? Which also Aga defines as the variety of registers with which he or she is acquainted, right? But then importantly, that this range may influence how people are able to participate in social activities. If I do not know law language, I might not be taken seriously when I talk to a lawyer about legal matters, right? Or in case of accent in the call center industry, if I don't speak with what is perceived as a neutral accent, I might not get a job, right? So repertoire is the linguistic features, domain is the context. So one way to define register is sort of this like semiotic linking between repertoire and domain, right? And one of the important things about it is that it's not evenly distributed. Different people have different experience and will have partial experience in registers. So I know enough legal jargon to jokingly say I object when somebody makes a claim about me, but I don't, I would like never be able to represent someone in a court. So let's see, does this make sense? Does register make sense? If anyone has questions about register in particular, we can talk about them before I move on to enregisterment.
Any questions?
If you did the reading and you have any questions too, it's a good time to chime in. It looks like maybe there's one.
Hello.
Oh,
yeah,
yes.
I have a question about registers. So, so drag queens are, known to use a lingo in which have terms which in usual English would mean something else, like reading, right? So drag queens, they read, and that's a completely different thing. And also many other things related to their makeup and, their basically the profession. So would that be I don't know, would that be a register then?
Yeah, thanks, Rom. That's a really wonderful, fun question. I take it you're probably watching RuPaul right now?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, I don't get that channel, but like I'm a huge RuPaul's Drag Race fan. So yeah, exactly, that would be a register. And that's like the really interesting thing and sort of the power of the idea of register when it comes to understanding sort of the limitation of the idea of denotational meaning, right?
Yeah,
is like the word read, when used in a certain context to denote, it has a meaning, right, when I'm a student, but it has a different sort of implication when I'm a drag queen. And it's not just that, that when I say read, if for those of you who are not followers of drag queens in the United States, they are a cultural phenomenon where men, usually gay men, sometimes trans women, dress up in exaggerated female clothing, and there's a whole culture surrounding it. And there's a great TV show, RuPaul's Drag Race, if anybody wants to watch. There's many seasons. And they have a whole set of words that they use, and we call that a lexical register, right? Because it's the lexical items for the most part that we're focusing on. There are some prosodic affects that they use as well. So for instance, they might do different things to try to sort of feminize the way that they speak. Like they use a little bit nasally tones, like they'll say, but they also use words like henty and read.
Exactly, yeah.
For them, read, it's like, to read when you're a drag queen is to basically make fun of somebody with a series of plays on words. So yeah, that would be a register. And that's the power of register too, is that the ability to know what the word read means isn't just like I can use that word correctly. It's also a whole set of semiotic and cultural baggage basically that comes along with being versed in a register. So someone who watches RuPaul, right, might know kind of what it means, but they only have somewhat a partial knowledge of that register. So it's a part of their range, but they're not fully versed in it. Where someone's a professional drag queen, they are able to detect what good reading is, what bad reading is. There's a whole set of cultural competencies, right, that come with the fact that they're aware of this register, right? So that's sort of like the social power. It's not just that we're talking about a variety of speech. We're talking about all of the different types of social interaction that are possible through the speech.
That was what I wanted to understand, that it could also be kind of a sociolect because only drag queens do it. And that also kind of intersects with the gender factor there.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a really great example. There is good work on like sort of queer linguistic anthropology as well, including work on drag queens. And also work on gender in India. Kira Hall is a great example. Yeah. She works on hijras and other forms of gender expression in India. Okay, great. So I think I have another question.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Yom. So the idea of repertoire domain mapping. Okay, so thank you for asking this. So this is actually a good question to lead me into my next slide. Because the idea of repertoire domain mapping and how that happens is often done in like social linguistics, where, for instance, they would want to write down all the features and where they're able to be used, right? So when a social linguist, and this is maybe a good time to sort of talk about the distinction between social linguistics and linguistic anthropology. So social linguists are often more interested in questions of sort of variation for the sake of variation. So like, for instance, what are the different ways that people speak in this region? Where are the boundaries of that region? And I think that's where mapping kind of comes into it. In linguistic anthropology, we don't usually talk about it in terms of mapping per se, but we do a similar thing. And it's less about like, where like, well, for instance, in our ethnographies, we'll notice where people say things and the context in which people say things. And it happens sort of in a qualitative way, not a quantitative way. So rather than doing a bunch of interviews where we ask like, 500 people from different regions, to say the same word, we would sort of hang out in a space and see who comes through it and try to understand the culture of a sort of given space. So things like dialectology and sociolectology are more the field of social linguistics. And the next slide, is there any other questions? Otherwise, I'll use that as a segue. Okay, I'm gonna use it as a segue.
I don't think so.
Oh yeah, yeah. Okay, cool, I'll use it as a segue then. Let me just get this. So this brings us to enregisterment. So instead of trying to map out registers, because of this whole issue of the fact that when you actually look at the way language manifests in society and communication manifests in society, it's really messy. So a really great example from my research would be people would say something like, you know, oh, people who say pleasure instead of pleasure, people from Bihar always say it that way, right? Then you would find someone from Bihar who didn't, right? So sometimes there's beliefs that we have about language and there's a social linking, even when it's not absolute. And there might be those sort of linguistic trends, but they're not complete. So one way to deal with that in variationalist social linguist is to fall back on statistics and try to understand the sort of trends in speaking, falling back on quantitative research. But the way linguistic anthropology approaches it is to sort of embrace the ideological side, right? So the thing that not in the work that signed you or I sent out, but in later work by Aga, he moves away from the idea of register to this idea of enregisterment, right? So by adding the affixes, he's turning a state or a thing into a process. So instead of thinking about and asking questions about what is the range, what is the domain, what is this, what is that, you're focusing on the processes, the social processes by which people are socialized to think that a form of speech is related to a type of person. So you're focusing rather than trying to sort of get a sense of how people are speaking, you're like looking for the sort of why people think that people speak that way, right? So this is a powerful move, right? Because all of a sudden you're moving from thinking, well, this is prescriptive to understanding that like neutral accent, right? There's no neutral accent, nobody speaks this way. You're able to actually approach it, right? As the study of description itself becomes a process through which people are made to speak differently, or a process through which language gets evaluated. Okay, so I'll talk a little bit more about this. So Asif, in the paper that I assigned you, he does talk about sort of the process through which things happen, and he calls it a reflexive process, or the use of reflexive language. And here what he means by reflexive is like using language to talk about language, or using behavior or language to reflect upon behavior or language, right? It's reflective in that sense. So metalinguistic discourse, metapragmatic discourse, that simply means metalinguistic discourse is talk about language. Metapragmatic discourse is basically talk about language use and the proper and correct use of language. So a really good example of this is if I went up to my teacher in school and I said, can I use the bathroom? Respond, I don't know, can you? They're using language to point out my grammar mistake, my quote unquote grammar mistake, right? So like by using language to talk about language, they are then getting me to say things in a different way, okay? It could also be an eye roll. The scores that were talked about for the language exams in the call centers would be an example of this. So if a 3 or 2, a 4 on the call center language assessor exams, those are all forms of metalinguistic commentary, right? So the processes of enregisterment mostly are these sort of reflexive processes through which people are conditioned to think about certain types of speech forms and associate them with certain types of places or people. And this is sort of a generative switch, because then you can move to thinking about the processes rather than trying to capture constantly changing language dynamics, right? So, Asif, he's my advisor, by the way. He always says, in social systems, living social systems, taxonomy is taxidermy. So rather than trying to map out a bunch of languages or language varieties, which anyway will change in a year, especially in a place like the call centers where like even between days we're constantly changing, and it was really socially uneven, you move from trying to like list types to focus on the process of type making, as that sort of elucidates perhaps more and also gives you a way to reach in on these ideas about language where they actually might not be completely reflecting the actual realities on the ground. So I hope that answers the sort of question about mapping. So one of these tools is to look at evaluative language. So for instance, or evaluative behavior. So this would include things like grammars. This includes the way that people talk about language, respond to language, you know, like things, or even behavior at large, but also like, for instance, let's say I wanted to like to take Yom's example, right? If I was an aspiring drag queen and I went to a drag show and I was supposed to read somebody, and my reading, right, if I'm making fun of them in that way that's very specific, was considered bad, people might boo me, right? They might say, boo, get off stage. Or if, let's say, I am an academic and I use a term that is central to my field in the wrong way, I might get some sort of feedback. People might say, oh, she used that term in the wrong way. They might say, like, she's not competent. All of these are evaluative moments where you can actually then study the process of evaluation as an empirical way of approaching language standardization and language, like the process of standardization itself, or the process of the othering of certain varieties. Is this making sense? Any questions so far?
No, there don't seem to be any questions.
Cool, cool. So in my case, this is an early chart from my research. Some things have switched, but and some of my IPA seems to have died in PowerPoint. But there would be a bunch of, so when I would interview trainers in the call center, they would have a bunch of different features that they would talk about. Because like I would ask them what a neutral accent was and they wouldn't be able to even give me an example of it. They would really struggle, right, to say exactly what it was. But if I asked them for mother tongue influence or what's non-neutral, they would have all these different sort of ideas, right? And then they would associate those. It could be accurately, it could be not accurately with certain regions, right? And you can see if you look at the features, this is also written for a non-linguistic audience, so some of the descriptions might not be super good. But some of the features that they would talk about with the way that they might describe it in some contexts, and then an identity label that gets associated. Note that I'm doing my research at this time in North India. You'll see certain regions that get excluded from the label neutral. So South Indian, Haryanvi, Himachali, Bihari, Eastern UP, Northeast, especially Northeast, got excluded a lot. South Indian, you know, and just also like education level, right? So when I made this at the very beginning of my research when I originally was just interviewing trainers. And then I proceeded over the course of the 5 years that I've been doing this to sit through training sessions to look at like training across India, but also hiring across like in different regions of India. So I was able to like get the opportunity to track and like experience some with a company that had offices in Hyderabad. And one of the things that kind of became clear, both through interviewing trainers from a wider array of places, but also through tracking some of this training, is that people from different regions and working in different regions would define neutral in different ways, right? So a great example is there was this girl in the training batch in Hyderabad who was from Jharkhand, and she had gone to Hyderabad to live with her sister. And she was, you know, in call center training. And her trainer, who was from Hyderabad, thought that she was one of the worst people in the class. But every time she was assessed, she got relatively high scores. But the thing was, the assessors, they were sitting up in Gurgaon. So there was actually like, because neutral is defined by sort of like what people are perceiving as or not natural, there's actually some really interesting things going on in terms of like, first of all, like which regions get excluded depending on where the office is, where the trainer's from, but then also like who gets hired as a trainer and where training centers are like located, and then also like how this affects judgments of migrant workers. So there's a lot to talk about here, and maybe this is a good point for questions, because I can talk maybe if people have specific interests about either grammatical categories in training or different sounds or sound patterns. I can talk about some of my observations, since all of you probably have a lot of interest there.
Yeah, Noel has a question. He's asking, could you give an example of aspiration of non-voiced stops in the Northeast?
Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay. So this is an interesting one. So people talked about that, but then this was one where because at my office that I worked at, like half the staff was like from the Northeast. Actually, like we had actually a situation where I got to spend a lot of time this last year learning quote unquote how to train for this. So for instance, like this was specifically individuals who are Tongkul speakers. I can give you an example from when, depending on where in the word, if it was like initial or intervocalic or final, people were pronouncing like ka or ga, right? It would sound either voiced or non-voiced to the trainers, right? So they would actually train people to like aspirate the sound when it was non-voiced to try to get over that. So like for instance, like pa and ba, so it's like saying picky bicky, the pa and the ba for the trainer would often sound like the same sound, if that makes sense. So like, and then when someone from the Northeast came in, that would be one of the things that they would check for, especially like if they were like from Nagaland or Manipur. Does that make sense? I should look at the chat. Sorry, my chat's not up. So like we might have them say like a word like a twister with lots of puz and buzz and cuz and guz. So like so the perceived difficulty that was associated with people from the Northeast, one was short and long vowels, right? Like sit and seat, with like the E sound. But the other was like voiced and non-voiced stops. Okay, chat. Okay, cool. We got some chat questions.
Inakshi has a question. Inakshi, you can come in.
Yeah. Hi, Kristina. Thanks.
Yeah.
Kristina, this is not about the chart at hand necessarily, but you had mentioned earlier that on Fridays, if somebody comes in for training and then they're not selected, on Saturdays they are. I mean, could you just throw a little bit of light on that?
Yeah,
and also
absolutely.
Thing, what does the mother tongue of the selector, the trainer, have to do in the selection process? Like, is there a pattern at all? And I also have a third question, but I think I should bring it on your presentation because it's broader. So.
Okay, cool. I mean, so let me just like make sure I got it. So the one question was about the mother tongue of the assessors or the trainers, and the other question, can you just say it one more time? The other question.
I just want to know if there is a pattern
being hired one day and not there. Absolutely.
Friday, Saturday thing.
Yeah.
But so, also, is there a pattern that you see?
Yeah. So yes, absolutely, there are patterns. I'm still working on some of my data analysis. I have a good, at least year and a half left of writing my dissertation. But there are some really clear patterns that were kind of impossible to miss out on. But in terms of like being rejected one day and hired the next, there could be lots of reasons for that. One is that you don't get the same language assessor, right, every time you have a call. And certain language assessors would be like we weren't allowed to talk to them, but we knew their names because some would be stereotypically easier going than others, right? But the other thing that could change is the hiring needs of the company, right? So if they really needed to hire a lot of people, then all of a sudden a lot of people would be passing the assessments, right? So I think that there's like a mix of things going on. The reason I said that in part was to just illustrate the fact that the selection of people wasn't just sort of like, do they pass a criterion? It's like a really complicated social process, which could have to do with what questions they were asked at a given moment, right? How familiar they were with questions. So like the way that the assessment happens is they're given words to say, but they're also given topics to speak on. And they're not standard across assessments. So they could be given a topic that they're more familiar with, they feel more confident in, and then impress people with their vocabulary, they ignore some of their sounds. Or they could get an assessor that has a different ability to hear mistakes, or just like cares less. Like there's all these things that go into like how someone actually like makes it through. And the role of sort of the company that's facilitating the interviews is to try to kind of sneak people through the cracks, which is a big part of my research, is looking at how people are sort of tweaked and snuck through. So it's mostly just the fact that it might be a different person. And I think what you're saying in terms of the background of the trainers, well, first of all, certain types of people get hired as a trainer, right? And that's the first thing to say, is that it's not like there's infinite, and this is part of like, you know, how neutral gets formed, right? Is there's not sort of infinite scope for who gets hired. And you can actually, like, I don't want to get too much into the history, but in the earlier days of the call center, you know, industry, a lot of the people working in those jobs were from some of the best schools, right? They were from like the St. Stephens and like the sort of like LSRs and like those like really high profile schools, and people who often grew up speaking English. They were much higher paid jobs, and therefore some of that has kept over into this period where like call center work is not very well paid, and the people who are looking for jobs are not from those backgrounds. But the trainers often come from urban backgrounds, often are convent educated. So there is some congruence in terms of their backgrounds, in terms of their socioeconomic backgrounds. They tend to be the ones in the industry, besides like the CEO or something like that, that come from sort of the place of most privilege, right? And therefore are given sort of the expertise to deem what is neutral, what is non-neutral. That being said, I did notice when I talked to trainers from different regions that they tended to have a bias towards their own region if they lived in that region. So if you're from the Delhi area, you work in Delhi, a lot of people would say, like, if you ask them one of my methods was to ask people, you know, like what candidates are the most trainable, right? So like, if you're from Delhi and you work in Delhi, you tended to say that people from the Delhi area or North India or Hindi speakers are more trainable. If you were from Bangalore and worked in Bangalore, you'd think that people from the South were more trainable. But people who were maybe like spoke Tamil, but like lived in Delhi, sometimes you would find them saying that they themselves had more MTI, and that it was actually easier to train other people. So I think the power structures are a little different in different regions. So who gets hired as a trainer, and then also what they had to go through in order to get hired in relation to their own accent, then impacts how they're making those judgments, if that makes sense. So it's a little bit more complicated than just their mother tongue. It's also these like social structures of power in relation to perceptions of mother tongue. A lot of them are actually native speakers of English. A lot of people who are trainers who are Anglo-Indians, or grew up even outside of India. And then there's a lot of trainers who might have a different mother tongue, but those are mostly the newer trainers.
Thank you, Kristina. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
I just want to ask one short question, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
So how it makes generalizations very difficult, right, for you? Because there are so many other variables to take into account, right?
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
In terms of so I guess like the goal of linguistic anthropology as sort of qualitative discipline isn't to make sort of like the be-all, end-all generalization, but rather to make theoretical interventions that shed some light on processes of linguistics. So I think that's also like one of the sort of like a big difference between a more approach that's more geared towards understanding language, right, and making generalizations about language, and like language in a specific area or specific context. Like if I make all these observations and then like there's another, economic depression like there was in 2008, which there is now, in a year, the observations about language that I make can be very different, but that's the case for anybody. So that's why if I focus on like processes, then at least there's some sort of theoretical insight into the process. And then whatever else I describe was a snapshot of the place and the time that I was in, right? That led me to those sort of theoretical interventions. That's makes sense.
Thank you, Kristina. Thank you so much.
Yep. Okay. Any other questions?
Kristina, Sakshi has a question.
Oh, great.
Sakshi, go ahead. Ask your question.
Hi. So I'd like to keep it short because I don't want to take too much time. But I was curious because you said people from Northeast were a lot of times excluded from mother tongue influence, and I want to understand why. Because I'm from Haryana, and I know that people from Haryana don't have a very good background in English. So a lot of times the grammar falls behind, and not just their accent.
Yeah.
But, there's a lot of discrimination towards Haryanvi accent being more rural and more rougher and louder and all those sort of things. So I wanted to know how much of this is social and how much of it is an actual some sort of similarity between the say prosody or sound system of Northeastern languages versus the sound system of say Haryanvi.
Okay, perfect. That's a really good question. And it's a really elucidating question, I think. So the question is if, like, first of all, a sort of comparison between like how they talk about Haryanvi versus the actual realities of people from Haryana versus how people talk about Northeasterners and the actual like sort of questions about like how real is the sort of distinction between perception and maybe the actual language. And I would say you're absolutely right that there were stigmas against Haryanvi. And I think especially one of the things I kind of noticed is that went hand in hand with caste a lot. And that was one of the instances where like caste discrimination seemed pretty there, especially when it came to people from the Jat community being perceived as people who would have a rougher way of speaking or not be as good at English. I mean, we had many candidates from Haryana, though, who would clear the language assessment. That was fairly common, right? Because the actual reality of these like young people from Haryana now is that some of them are from rural backgrounds, but there are lots of convent schools in Haryana. There's wealth is pouring in to like, especially Gurgaon, right? And a lot of them would come from Gurgaon. So you have people actually going to like, and having a fairly like what you might call a assimilated way of speaking, where they speak more like what elite Delite would call a neutral accent, right?
Yes.
So I would say that in my experience, they would often point to someone's Haryanviness as a reason for them making mistakes. But you did see a lot of people getting hired from Haryana, and frankly, the call centers, most of them are in Haryana, right?
Yes.
On the other hand, what really stuck out to me from the Northeastern group is that, especially early on, before I myself sort of be socialized into the role of trainer when I was just trying to figure things out, a lot of Northeastern candidates would come in and I would be like, wow, their English is so good, their accent sounds so understandable to me. And then they would get to the interview and even like the HR would just be like, no, empty. And I think there's a couple of things going on with that. One is the sort of speech goal that I feel most Northeastern people are trying to reach is not to sound like a North Indian elite.
Yes.
So there would be some Northeastern candidates that would actually like be then labeled as having a little bit of an American accent, and they would call it fake, and they would be rejected. So like if they like accented on their like cuz and their puz, which ironically was a training method for them too, or like depending on the ways they spoke their vowels, you know, they would be either told they have a fake American accent, or you know, if they had like short, long vowel distinctions, they had too much MTI. And part of what's going on, I think, is a lot of HR workers and assessors are actually from Haryana, right? Or they're from the area. So what sounds distant to them is different. But another factor that plays a role is racial discrimination, right? And part of that might just be sort of plain at your face, ethnic discrimination, but part of it is also the accents that people are used to hearing and what sounds more other. However, when it comes to the actual BPO situation, I interviewed a lot of Northeastern people because there were a lot working in our office who had worked in call centers. And they would say that most, especially Americans or British people for that matter, would prefer to speak to them because they didn't sound Indian. So the racism that happens on the phone call when people talk to an Indian accented individual, that's the accent that they associate with call centers. There's a lot of racial undertones when it comes to that. So sometimes, like my one friend, she used to sometimes pretend to be a manager. So when someone asked to speak to a manager, they would just give the phone to her because she was Nagamese and her accent sounded different to them. So it wasn't even like what's clearer, it's just like what was more associated with negative racial stereotypes for people, in this case in England, right? So it wasn't that, I mean, it doesn't seem as if people are either good or bad at English, and that's not really the point. The point is the assessors and the trainers, them determining what's neutral has a lot to do with where they're from, what they're used to hearing, and then what gets othered socially.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yep, you're welcome. Okay. I don't have many slides left, so I think I'm gonna get to the end and then we'll see if we have time for any more questions. Thanks for bearing with me. Okay, so this is kind of summing it up. So like this quote is from an interaction, you know, oh, well, she's from Bihar, they have accent issues, right? So what we have is that speech sound, like some patterns that I would notice is that speech sounds, there was actual impact of speech sounds, right? And we can't ignore the fact that those have regional correlates. However, those regional, they often, like people who came from non-metro areas or second-tier cities, sometimes would struggle a little more to get jobs. And part of that is actually maybe how people are speaking, and that's an important variable, one which I myself take into account, especially since I've been trying some like acoustic phonetic methods as well from my time at JNU, which is really fun. But then there's also like the sort of perception side of things. So the fact that accent, right, from this perspective is always not just the speech itself, it's the speech plus person, right? And like the idea of the person, you always have both going on. So for instance, we had this one guy who came in for an interview. He cleared his language exam and he cleared it multiple times, but every time he got to the end of the interview, they would not believe that he had cleared his accent, his language exam. And I think he went for the interview like 6 times. And every time he'd go for the interview and come back the next day and come again. And I would be told to sit with him, talk to him. And I would be like, I can't figure it out. But then I learned that maybe what was going on wasn't that his accent was off. It turned out like he was the son of an autowala, right? So he came from a fairly economically disadvantaged background. Evidence of that showed in other aspects of his comportment or on his CV. And then perhaps that was the reason why he was not getting selected. So sometimes, so the power of this is that whenever you have to kind of look at both, like beyond just the speech itself to get at the full picture of whether they're being hired or not. I think I talked about these other patterns. Yeah, but also like there's no there's no like, there's often not like a way to directly link the way someone speaks to customer satisfaction, as customer satisfaction scores are kind of usually generally from the call, just are you satisfied with the call or not? They don't ask about the language in particular. So it's kind of, in some ways, like I was talking about, working in a bubble where it's not really, it's about how people perceive Americans or British people to understand language rather than any sort of evidence in and of itself, which allows for a neutral accent to target these distinctions that are meaningless, right, to an American who hasn't grown up in India to know that when someone says pleasure, they might be from Bihar, right? When I first started, I couldn't even hear the difference between pleasure and pleasure. Like it was like very difficult for me to hear. So it's not just like what accent is neutral then, it's also who is neutral, who is not neutral. And then in this industry, like who gets to be global in their English and who is ascribed to region and who even is excluded from region, right? So like the people whose language is deemed appropriate for global interactions with foreigners versus Indian interactions. And then when it came to Northeasterners, they actually, when we got them jobs, usually got jobs in the non-voice sector, right? Because their accent was considered too regional for the call center jobs, but then their Hindi would always be considered unacceptable for like the domestic call centers. So there was kind of like a double catch for them. Okay, so then there's all my thanks to different funding institutions and to JNU for hosting me last year. We're excited. Okay, any other questions? Thank you guys so much for listening.
Thank you, Kristina.
I just want to say thank you, Kristina. That was wonderful, absolutely. It was such a
thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Now I'm in a silent mood, and so other people will ask you questions.
Thank you so much, Aisha. I hope everybody kind of got an idea of what linguistic anthropology is. If you ever have more questions, feel free to reach out to me. Maybe we can like circulate my email. I'm really happy to talk. I'm very isolated and alone right now in my apartment for the next, month after a month of isolation. So I'm really happy to chat with people.
Okay, so anyone has questions, please go ahead. Yeah, let me have a look at the chat.
Oh, yeah, I'll get to the chat too. Now I can see it. I'll stop. Did I stop sharing? Yeah, I did. Thank you. Also, if you have questions about the call centers and BPOs themselves, I know it's like a fairly familiar topic for a lot of Indians, which it is not for a lot of Americans. But like I could talk about the history of the neutral accent, how it's changed over time. I could also talk about language variety or any sort of theoretical linguistics questions. Oh, I can actually share my mail ID here. That's a good idea.
Yeah.
Kristina, can I share your email in the chat? So if
yeah, I just did. I'm just doing it right now. Okay. There, that's my my email address.
Okay, so any questions? This is the time to ask them.
Yeah, and also if you have questions about your own research and how to like think about linguistic anthropology tools, maybe. One thing that kind of I've noticed is that there's not a lot of crossover between generative linguistics and linguistic anthropology, in part because they exist in different departments. Okay, yeah, Aisha, go ahead.
So I wanted to understand what the title of your talk, how it, and especially the concept of enregisterment. How would you see it playing out with the neutral accent question?
Yeah.
So is it or isn't it? Right. So or is it? Are you working theoretically? expanding, if you want, the process as not really constituted by the speaker who speaks in a register, but actually as a social constituted process, which is variable in its, not in its degrees, but basically who is participating in the enregistrement.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, no, that's a really really great way to put it, and I think that almost answers the question for me. But I think so. One of the aspects of yes, I would say first of all, the neutral accent is not a manner of speech as such, but rather a process of enregisterment is what I would say. And I think most standards, right, whenever you have a standard, it actually speaks a standard, right? And that's one of the things that like linguistic anthropologists will often say is that no one ever speaks a standard, right? Like even people who are supposed to, they don't. And like this is, like familiar terrain for linguists in general, right? With the difference between like, performance, right, versus competence. But since nobody actually speaks a standard, the question is then what does a standard do? And by looking at enregisterment sort of as a process of socialization, so for instance, thinking in terms of like what is neutral accent as a process that then becomes a structure that is a structure of discrimination between modes of speech, but also between people. I'm able to study sort of like that some of the reflexive ways and the linguistic ways that those ways of speaking a language that are central to the theory of enregisterment like happen. So for instance, like I can start thinking on the one hand about different categories that get utilized, like mother tongue influence, how that's used, tracking the way that MTI or mother tongue influence gets used by whom, in what context, right? Because it does the same thing for everybody. And then also like thinking about like specifically about like the different contexts and the different like that people find themselves in. So for instance, like who is using the word mother tongue influence, right? Where are they from? What's their educational background? Who else is involved in the interaction? Like, so for instance, if a trainer is from Delhi and is, from an upper class background, how does he or she then relate to this or like use this tool MTI differently than other people? And then how can we then think of neutral as a semiotic phenomenon, right? Where the word neutral like becomes sort of like almost like a horizon where you're always defining things that are not neutral and different people are defining it in different ways. But at the point, somewhere around the nexus of where power is being defined, right? Like, so like, people who have the most privilege, they end up landing in neutral just by virtue of not being regional, right? So that then gives you insight into other social processes like globalization or like how social privilege functions sort of on a day-to-day activity level. So instead of just saying someone has privilege, like what does it actually mean, right? To say that this person is privileged, and what are the sort of day-to-day social interactions, which usually don't involve necessarily a positive definition, but rather this sort of distancing from positions of less privilege or other people undergoing discrimination by virtue of being marked, right? So one of the other theories that I've been working on is what is sort of social markedness, sort of from taking Jacobson's theories of markedness and thinking about like, what is the process of enregistrement in terms of gang, and what kinds of language get used to do that, like to make someone marked or othered. So I don't know if that answers your question. I kind of
it does. Can I just, Yanchan, is it okay if I ask one more?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, no one else has a question. Yeah, so
So what struck me was from the linguistic literature also this term mother tongue influence. It is seen as contamination, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Mother tongue influence doesn't make you legible.
Yeah.
It doesn't, and so it's nothing. And so
exactly.
So I was wondering whether caste in particular, so is the discrimination that you mentioned, this idea of pollution, because this is a very, now just give me like, so I want to contrast it with another form of enregisterment. I can't do this too many syllables, whatever, E. I want to contrast it with E, right? Is, I've noticed in Bengali speakers that there is, when people, I think they have some remote connection to Eastern varieties of Bangla. So I've seen in Rahul's, my husband's family, that his sister-in-law was once upon a time really East Bengali, but there's really no difference in the Bangla they speak currently in the home or in pub. But when they are making a joke, etc., they move to Eastern dialects.
Yeah.
So they don't want to say kichu, then they'll say kissu, and they'll say, no, they won't say ja, they'll say za. And you can see that it is a registral move, if you want. So there you see in the context, right, where you actually get a register formation. But it's not monetized, it's not a condition of labor or any of those things. Right?
Yeah,
discrimination is part of the condition of labor, deciding that this has to be correct. I was wondering whether caste also then plugs into this, so that while they might call it region, they actually mean caste.
Absolutely. So, I mean, and there's complicated. So first of all, in terms of like the humor, there's actually really good work, and I hate plugging my advisor, but like Asaf Aga does good work on trope, right? And norm. So sometimes people will like use regional varieties, for instance, in order to make a joke in situations where they might not otherwise use them. Or they use sort of language in a non-normal way as a means to highlight the ridiculousness or some aspect of the interaction. In terms of caste, caste definitely comes up, I think, in humor, it's economic or not. But in terms of like the linkage and tracing the sort of empirical linkage between caste and the neutral accent, originally I found that quite difficult because though a lot of different factors can be overtly asked in a business environment, caste was the one taboo that kind of was not originally sort of like overtly allowed to be talked about, right? So they could ask their father's occupation. They could ask, their last name, but they couldn't necessarily ask their caste. So at first that posed a huge challenge for me, like not being from India, I'm obviously not as intricately familiar with the sort of social diacritics of caste, right? How to tell whether someone's, from upper or lower caste background. But then, so that was a little bit difficult for me to get into, but it became very apparent when I started to look at how they were choosing who to call in to the office for interviews or not. So for instance, when they look at a CV on Monster or Naukri, right, one of the things that people would take into consideration is perhaps someone's last name, right? And then that became a sort of like almost like not ever talked about, but very striking example of where clearly there was a caste element to how people were being selected. It didn't mean that, and actually there's like, what was the book? But it didn't mean that all the people in the call for upper caste, but there were definitely like, the other side of things too is like, it's really hard to separate caste from economic class. So economic class, educational background, and right, like those are all things that like are closely linked to but not reducible to caste, I guess. So I think that it definitely is a little tricky to wheedle out whether someone's hearing caste or hearing economic class. But I think that it's both often. And often what I noticed happening when I really sort of sat down and tried to listen to what people were saying around me is there would be these moments, usually sort of in hush-hush whisper groups in the corner, often in Hindi and not in English, where people would sit and they would talk. They would refer to caste without saying it, right? And the places where I saw this, I actually wrote a conference paper about this, was often in metaphors of someone's home. So like a chigar ke log, though that doesn't always mean caste, very clearly often meant caste when they talked about hiring. Quality ke log, right? So if someone was of quality, like sometimes when they switched to Hindi, I noticed that it seemed like they were very clearly talking about someone's caste background as a way of sort of indicating that they were no longer in the professional environment of English. So yes and no. I mean, it's complicated, I think, is the answer. That caste was definitely present, but always covertly, almost always covertly present. Or only, or the most overt it would come was also sort of like in secret. And one way to approach that is theoretically through the idea of an avoidance register. So avoidance registers are registers that are defined by words or grammatical categories or sounds that they avoid. And in this case, I would call it a caste avoidance register, where one of the types of sort of like liberal, socially acceptable speech in India is one which has these creative ways of talking about caste without actually talking about caste. So yeah, I mean, like the answer is yes, caste was always there, though really hard to dissect from economic stuff, except in these moments of active avoidance.
We have one last question. So,
okay.
Suchishmita was asking a question.
Hi, Christine.
Yeah, Suchishmita, go ahead.
Yeah, hi, Kristina. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yeah. Hi. So the talk was really nice, and I have one question which goes back to the first point that you were talking about, neutral accent. So going by the talk, it seems like the neutral accent is a constantly shifting register.
Yeah.
Because there is no way in which we can define what exactly constitutes a neutral accent. So, I mean, and given that we are talking about the call center industry, so this is a very post-1990s phenomena, the coming in of the globalization and so on. So, but before the 1990s, when, Rapidex was so big in India in terms of asking people how to learn English, if today the neutral accent is something like an American accent that most people are trying to aspire for, or this neutral accent, do we have anything which was before, the call center boom came? Because English has always been, the currency of power, right?
Yeah.
And just one more quick comment. Going back to the question of caste and how you were trying to explain caste versus privilege, given that I was also doing my fieldwork, and I think we have had this exchange before, I was thinking that one of the other ways of thinking about it would be that because there is what you call the caste avoidance register, the other way would be to think about it as in terms of cultural capital. Because and we are also in an atmosphere of call centers where there is so much of, emphasis on the individual. Like, for instance, it's not structures that are inhibiting you. You just have to learn this language and then you will be, reaching the zenith of success and whatnot. There's so much of motivation that goes on, and there's a language that inhabits this universe. So thereby the language becomes increasingly individualistic, where you're discouraged from thinking about structures of caste, but in terms of education. So cultural capital becomes another way of actually talking about caste without talking about caste. Yeah. So I thought, it might be an interesting way of also, formulating this this great absent presence of caste, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think I'll take that first, and then I'll talk about the neutral history thing second. So absolutely, and I think what kind of comes to the front is also like, how do we think of caste, right? Is it an immutable identity category where everybody has it, or do we only think about it when it's visible, right?
Yeah.
So, for instance, there have been recorded instances of people hiding their caste in call centers. And if you hide it, the question is like, is it there, right? So obviously on one level, yes, right? But on another level, for some people, you could argue, right, these sort of cultural capital markers that get associated with caste are much more salient than others, right? The only thing that I will that I think is tricky then when it comes to role and like privilege is that there's a lot of overlap of different categories. And I don't think that, and it becomes hard to segment a single one out when it comes to cultural capital, right? So for instance, is the fact that somebody says, major, is that because of their regional background? Right, if they're from a poorer area, is it because of their caste background? Is it because of their educational background? The answer is yes, right? Like it's a combination of those things. And caste is definitely a factor, but it's not the only factor, because like you'd also find plenty of, Adhamas coming in and not pronouncing the words in the exact same way, right? But from the sort of register perspective, it's looking at these moments where caste gets associated, right, with certain ways of speaking. And if people don't talk about caste, it's really hard to find those points of association within the call center environment. You can either look outside of the call center environment where those associations are being made. Would happen, sometimes with an after work drink. Or you can look for like these sort of like absences, and then other things that like clearly like link up, right? Like the fact that like one of the ways I also look at it is I look at the father's occupation as sort of like a social class, also potentially a caste indicator. Though obviously it's not a perfect one-to-one mapping. But yeah, that's definitely, obviously there's clearly a very clear link between caste and these other markers of relative lack of privilege. Whether it's spoken or how they're dressed or what movies they like, all of these things come into play in terms of even like skin color. Like, all these different things would be involved when people are trying to perceive somebody's caste, right? And some, they may be right, they may be wrong when they make those judgments, but like one of the challenges that I had to face and was trying to figure out where those judgments were being made. In terms of like neutral and this variety, so first of all, the neutral accent as it is today is actively not American. I was told often that I have mother tongue influence, which I thought was cute because like, what's my mother tongue that's influencing my mother tongue? But also, if someone had too much of an Americanism, like after I tried to train them and they picked up on some of my less neutral aspects of the way I speak, they would be said that they have a fake accent and they don't want them. So in the current sort of avatar of the neutral accent, there are some overlaps with some varieties of American English. There's more overlaps with received pronunciation or a BBC English. And then there's some things about it that are very centrally, very, very Indian, right? In the early days of the call center accent training, they specifically trained foreign varieties of English. So for instance, like in the 90s and into like the early 2000s, all of the trainers were training American accent, British accents, Australian accents, depending on who they were supposed to be talking to. And then there's sort of a shift that happened, right, in the mid 2000s, where some of the larger call centers started to have a policy where they didn't feel like it was economically viable to continue to try to train people to speak with an American accent when Americans had become aware that outsourcing was happening. They had become much more perceptive when it comes to people trying to pretend like they're in America, right? And there's a lot of racist responses to this. So around that sort of like 2002, 2003 into like, you know, like the first decade of the 2000s, you see the emergence of what they call accent neutralization. And it starts to sort of like solidify, right, as a language ideology towards the end of that first decade, where all of a sudden, like time I came to the field, almost, there's a few that don't do it, almost all of the legitimate call centers, the ones that are not scamming centers, were training towards an English that they called neutral. Now, what Indian accent is the other question too, right? So it's not just any Indian accent, right? When it was being solidified sort of as a standard, it was more or less the way a lot of people already spoke in the call center. And the people who were being hired sort of in the early 2000s, let's just say like the salary was much better. You know, they were young, recent graduates from like elite institutions or like convent educated. So it was the way that these people who already came from these elite backgrounds of English medium, especially convent English medium education, were already speaking. And and before that, like even before sort of like the 90s, if you follow documentaries and Indian documentaries and things like that, you also see sort of a shift going on sort of around the 80s in the media, right? In terms of, and I haven't really, I need to, this is like was one of my goals, just to like sort of do an analysis of this when I get more of my actual analysis done. You start to see a sort of a specific type of Indian act embraced more widely in the media, where previously, you know, like in all Indian radio, in Indian radio, BBC India news, but also like national news, people were trying to speak as much like a BBC English or received pronunciation as possible. And at some point, like around the 80s, it seems, there's like a sort of switch from that to this sort of like slightly more Indianized version, which sometimes gets called convent English. So the variety kind of already existed as a prestige register. It just wasn't being neutral, where it starts to get called neutral, because obviously, like if you're hiring people and you say you want convent English, you're almost, I mean, you're like overtly discriminating instead of covertly discriminating. So does that make sense? That's kind of like the history of how it emerges.
Yeah, no, it absolutely makes sense, because where I did some of my fieldwork in Gurgaon, why I asked about the American accent was because the instructor was really insistent on American accent, which I thought was a little, you know, funny, because precisely what you said, right? Like now we are trying to move away, and there is no need to pretend that you are actually Harry, but you're really Harish, you know, and you don't have to do that.
So I can't talk about specific companies. Oh, sorry.
I'm sorry to butt in, Kristina, but what's happened is that, I don't know, there's some setting ka chakkar, and basically people are being thrown out of the meeting and can't join back in.
Oh, no.
Because there was a 2-hour limit on the meeting.
Oh, okay, like that.
Yeah, okay, sorry.
Right?
Oh, is it gone for 2 hours? Holy man.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, guys.
Yeah, but you have the world record for the longest, and actually people have to go do dinner. And
well, my goal was to just do the 30 minutes, so I guess I went a little bit over, but I got excited. So thanks for all the good questions.
Thank you. Wonderful discussion. And we're going to call it a day now because various people can't. And I'm sorry, Smita, for having cut you off.
Oh yeah, we'll just continue the conversation.
Yeah, and you have my number, right? I think you're on my WhatsApp, so just message me and we can talk about that, because I can give you more details. Yeah.
Okay. So thank you,
Kristina?
everybody.
Yeah.
Thank you, Kristina. And we'll be in touch in other ways.
Yeah, and everyone reach out if you want.
Yes, thank you, Kristina. Thank you for a wonderful, wonderful talk. For everybody else who's still on, Lalit Rajkumar is speaking on the 13th of April at 11 a.m. That's a Monday. And the topic is packaging of information blocks and movement. So please try and be there. And Kristina, thank you once again. It was absolutely amazing.
Okay, thanks everybody. I'll leave now. I gotta get back to work. Everybody be safe and stay isolated.
You too, take care.